like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the museum, the Nebraska History Museum, on the third Thursday of every month. For a detailed schedule of the programs that we offer as part of this series, you can go to our website at nebraskahistory.org, and there you'll also find information about other programming that we have going on here at the museum. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast the programs on public access television, and now we are also posting them on YouTube. So people all over the country, in fact all over the world, can have access to these programs. Today's speaker is Linda Hein, Assistant Reference Curator for the Nebraska State Historical Society. Linda, prior to having this job at the Society, was site manager for the Historical Society's Senator George Norris House in McCook. And she is going to talk today about George Norris, the man. So please help me welcome Linda Hein.
Well, thank you. As the sign says, today I'm going to talk more about George Norris, the man, instead of all of the good and wonderful and lasting things that he did. But how many of you have no idea who George Norris was even? Is there anyone? I was thinking pretty much this would be an audience of George Norris fans. I was hoping so anyway. But I do run across a lot of people that have no idea who George Norris is, and even when I was working at the House, some people were sure that he was governor, and I know he wasn't governor of Nebraska. But the life of George W. Norris is the story of America at its best, and that was a quote that came from one of the Washington newsmen. And newsmen generally, the press loved George Norris because he was exactly the same guy. You could get exactly the same conversation out of him, whether he was in his sunroom in McCook or whether he was on the Senate floor or if you ran into him on the street. He was the same guy. But just in case, just to remind you, I wanted to very briefly run through some of the things that he did. He was 10 years in the House of Representatives and then another 30 years after that in the Senate. He took power away from Senator or Speaker of the House Joe Cannon, which he hated partisanship, and that was a big part of it. And he was a master at parliamentary procedure, and that helped him do it. And I'll talk a little, if we have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific things that he did. Rural electrification, REA, of course, changed the countryside forever. TVA changed the lives of generations of people in 7 southern states. Very unusual for a man from Nebraska to work over 20 years for 7 southern states, but he did. He felt it was that important. The 20th Amendment, the lame duck amendment that changed the starting time for the sessions. Nebraska's one-house legislature, our unicameral system, wasn't George's idea, but it wouldn't have happened. All these things wouldn't have happened without George Norris. He wasn't the only man, certainly, working on all these things, but none of them would have happened without him hanging in there on it. And then the Norris-LaGuardia Act ending the yellow dog contracts. He got into that simply by going to campaign against Senator Vare in Pennsylvania and ended up getting a ride from a miner. And of course they had a nice long chat while he was taking him in the buggy to get to where they were going, and he really understood the plight of the miners and went to bat for them too. So this is where it all started, though. This is his home place near Clyde. I started to say Berea. Clyde, Ohio. It's actually about 3.5 miles outside of the town. And it was a land of trees and swamps and rocks and stumps, lots of stumps that George had to dig out. It wasn't real good land, but they raised wheat and they raised fruit trees. A more modern This is a more modern picture of the house, and it was actually built by his father, Chauncey. And George was born here July 11th, 1861. And I visited this house about 8 years ago, and I actually was up in what used to be the loft, where George wrote about the snow sifting down through the shingles onto his face at night. And I don't think the owners actually ever knew that I was up there. But when my husband and I stopped, just the teenage kids were at home and they didn't care. So they showed me the upstairs, and I got to see the summer kitchen, and I got to go out in the barn and see the pegged barn. So I got a really nice tour from the kids. I hope the parents forgave them. I'll go on. I'll get the hang of this yet. These are George Norris's parents, Chauncey and Mary. Chauncey was Scotch-Irish. Mary was Pennsylvania Dutch. They moved down to Ohio from New York State so they could be near Mary's relatives. She had some relatives living there. And their firstborn was a boy born in New York, John Henry. And when they moved down, of course, he was growing up. When the Civil War was starting to gear up, he promised his mother that he would not join up. He would not get involved. But like most young men at that age, he did get involved. He did volunteer. And what hurt his mother, George said, more than anything was the fact that he broke his promise to his mother. Not so much that he was going, but he had promised that he would not go, and he did. He was marching with Sherman to the sea, and while they were in Georgia, he took a fairly minor wound in the thigh, and he wrote to his mother. He sent her a letter saying, "Don't worry, it's going to be fine. It's a minor wound, and I'll be okay in a couple of days." Well, by the time the letter reached Mary, he was already dead. He died 3 days later, and that's really stuck with George, too. His brother meant a great deal to him. And so George, then on December 1st, 1864, that was the end of May when John Henry died. And then the same year, December 1st, Chauncey was going to the grist mill to have the wheat ground into flour. It was December, for heaven's sakes, it's cold. But George, 3.5 years old, was crying. He wanted to go. He'd never gotten to go. And his mother finally said, okay, and then the girls wanted to go, the two closest girls. So Chauncey and Mary, they bundled them all up, and they went off to the grist mill. And I actually, while I was back in Clyde, Ohio, I kept asking around, where is this grist mill? Nobody knew. So I finally said, is there a pond? So I found the mill pond, so I was actually at the grist mill where they went. When they left the grist mill, they headed home, and they stopped at a neighbor's house not far away to pick up a cultivator that the neighbor had borrowed. And they headed home with that. The cultivator was kind of clanging around, but a rabbit jumped out in front of the horses and scared them. And they got to running, and he couldn't get them under control. And by the time he managed to reach home, he wedged the wheel of the wagon up against a rock. Mary heard the clamor, heard them coming, came out, got the kids off. Chauncey said he was going to take time to cool the horses down, got them out there. They got away from him again. They jumped the fence. The two wheels fell off of the back of the wagon. By the time he managed to get home and had cooled the horses down, he was dripping with sweat. Came in, it's December. He caught a cold that night. By the next day, it had moved into pneumonia, and 3 days later, he was dead. So in 7 months, she's lost her oldest son. She's now lost her husband. She is 56 years old. She's 7 months pregnant with her 12th child, and she still has 7 kids at home, and her only boy is 3.5 years old. So that brings us to Mary. If I can get Mary to come up. There, that's Mary. And like I say, she was quite a woman. She was a huge influence in George Norris's life. She worked hard. She spun the clothes even. She spun the cloth for the clothes that the kids wore. In fact, George was wearing a suit later on that had been, she had made the cloth for that coat even. Her spinning wheel, her original spinning wheel is still in the Norris house in McCook. So it's a great big thing. She read the Bible to the kids every Sunday, and she planted vegetable garden and took her place out in the field too when she needed to. When she was 49 years old, she remarried to they called him an elderly, Pennsylvania Dutch man. He was a carpenter, very good carpenter. And he was good to the kids. But when she was 74 years old, then 25 years later, she divorced him. And when she died, when she was 82 years old, there is not a mention of that man in her obituary. So she was one strong woman. That is George and his mom. And this brings up probably a famous story that you've all heard. It was a warm spring morning, and his mom was out planting another fruit tree. And she called George over to help her plant it. And he said, "Mom, why are you working so hard? You know, you'll be dead by the time this tree's in bearing." And she looked at him, and she very thoughtfully said, "Yes, Willie." She always called him Willie. "I know," but she said, "Someone will. You know, I may not be around, but someone's going to benefit from the fruit of this tree." And George Norris always kept that attitude when he was working so hard for things that wouldn't come to fruition for years and years and years, maybe generations. They were the ones that were really going to benefit from REA and TVA. His mother's influence was huge on him. Oh, I was going to mention too, she died in 1900 at 82 years old, and George was preparing to go see her at the time when she died, and he didn't get that last visit in. And one time he was on the rail car in Washington, D.C., and it was on a Sunday. He was heading to the office, and there was a young man saying goodbye to his mother. And obviously they were taking too long because some of the people on the rail car were complaining, "Let's get going." And he got up and he said, "Young man, you take as long as you want to say goodbye to your mother. These people going to church can just wait, or they can get down on their knees and pray here." But he said, "This may be the last time you see your mother. You need to take your time." So Mom meant a lot. And George Norris, about 12 years old. He was not always good all the time, and especially not growing up, and he liked to play jokes. But Isaac, the second husband, and Mary would take trips to White House, which was about 50, 60 miles away. And Isaac prided himself on not having to have an alarm or anything. He knew when it was time to get up. And they always got up well before dawn, and they headed to White House. So George decided that after they retired, he went to the big grandfather clock and he stopped it. And then he went to the secondary clock and he set it ahead 3 hours. And so Isaac got up and he was just appalled. I mean, he had overslept, and he got Mary up and she was mad, and she was slamming around in the kitchen, muttering to himself, George said. And Isaac went out and got the horses ready, and they took off grumbling at each other. And when they got to White House, they made it in record time. But George said even when they got back, they were still trying to figure out what on earth happened to them. Why did all that happen? So George never told them. I don't know if that had anything to do with the divorce. I hope not. This is Baldwin University. He finished his proper schooling at 14, went off to college with 2 of his sisters. And he said, "You haven't lived until you've shared a 2-room apartment with 2 good-looking girls." So they didn't have bathroom facilities, of course, and it was a very, very slim existence. I mean, they were very poor, but Mary was very big on education. George would never be able to go like a whole year at a time. He'd take a session of school, and then he'd drop out and teach school to make enough money, to keep going. So he went to Baldwin University first in Berea, and then he went on to Northern Indiana Normal School. Yeah, this is not a picture you normally see of George Norris. There on the right, he was Igmar in a play when he was teaching one time at White House, Ohio, which he did. I mean, he'd teach, he'd go back to school, on and off all the time. And this was one of his classes at White House, Ohio. Sometimes he had as many as 70 students. They ranged from 22 years old to 4 years old. And one time he had a girl who, when he got there, the teacher pretty much had never been in charge. The students pretty well ran the school. And this one girl, he reprimanded her in class. And when they came back in to start in school again, he called the roll and she wouldn't answer. And he called her name again and she wouldn't answer. And so he dismissed her, he kicked her out. And the next day she was there, and the school board president was there, and he talked a good talk and said, well, you know, I think we can let her back in now. And George said no. She was disrespectful. She's not going to go along with the rules. I'll be very willing to keep her if she will answer the roll. She wouldn't do it. So the school board said, nope, the teacher's right. So from then on, he got along great with the kids. They taught him to dance. His mother didn't like card playing, dancing, anything like that. So he mastered the kids. When he was at Northern Indiana Normal School, he was part of a literary society, and it kind of broke into two factions, the Crescent Society. And George Norris was running for president of the Crescent Society, and he didn't get elected. So his little faction decided they would break off and start their own. So they started the Loyal United Nine, and that's the only picture I have of all 9 of them. I think it went down to about 6 fairly quickly with deaths. So they actually weren't known as the Loyal United Nine, though. They were known as the Lunatics under Norris, and that stuck all their lives. And these guys had reunions every year from 1893 on. Oops, I want to go back. This was their cabin. Actually, several of them pooled their money in I think it was 1906. They pooled their money to buy an island in Rainbow Lake, up on Chano Lakes near Wapaka, Wisconsin. Cost $950 for this whole island. And this was George's cabin that he built up there, and it's the cabin that actually just is having, well, it's still for sale now, I believe. They had a silent auction, or an estate sale, I guess they called it, about a month and a half ago. And that's the first time that all of George's stuff has been for sale. But it passed down from George to his son-in-law, John Robertson, married to George's oldest daughter, Hazel. And then from then it went on down to John's nephew, and then to his nephew's son, and now it's his nephew's son's wife, or widow, I guess I should say, he just passed away, who is selling the cabin. So for the first time since 1906, it won't be in Norris' hands anymore. But I have a lot of pictures of the cabin and the guys because I like it. They had fun. They always seemed to be dressed up, but they were fairly casual for them. They had a lot of fun. The wives were involved. They'd bring their kids. When they had grandchildren, they'd bring their grandchildren. They had reunions every single summer up at Rainbow Lake at Wapaka. That's E.E. Smith holding the fish. He and George Norris were the last 2 LUNs alive. And I don't know who survived who. I'd have to double check. There, another picture of them. The man with his foot up on the stair, that is Harney Hazard Harrington. And Harney Hazard Harrington was George Norris's law partner in Beatrice, Nebraska, when he first came to Nebraska in the 1880s. Swimming, love E.E. Smith's big belly there. But even the women would get into the lake and go swimming. They got dressed up a lot more. There was a trolley that ran on into Wapaka, so they would get in the boat and go over and take the trolley into Wapaka for tea in the afternoons. And this is where they went on the last night when they were up there. Usually it was about 2 weeks. George spent all summer up there quite often too. But at the end of the reunion, I had Harney Hazard Harrington's granddaughter in, and she used to actually go up there when they were all there. And she said at the end of the reunion, they would get all gussied up and they'd climb in the boats and they'd sail across the lake to the lodge hall, and that's the lodge hall. They would have sit-down dinner, they would have printed menus, and they would give speeches, so they ended it properly. This is an interesting one. This is Kate, and she was George Norris's fiancée. That's about all I know about her, except that she was still on an Indiana farm waiting for him when he finally hit Beatrice and then Beaver City, and he and she, I guess, had had enough of the West that she didn't think it was for her, but in any case, they broke up when he was in Beaver City. And so she never did come west with him. But I find it interesting that I don't have a wedding picture of he and Pluma together, and I don't have a picture of he and his second wife, Ellie, together. But I find it interesting that I do have one of Will and Kate, the one he didn't marry. When he got to Beaver City, he was a member of the Knights Templar, and he had been a member of the Masonic Order back in Ohio too, but he retained his membership in this particular club throughout his life. And in a lot of the portraits of him, you'll see the little Masonic pin. And he was also in the Oddfellows in Beaver City too. I went to an auction of actually the Beaver City Masonic Lodge when they kind of broke up and joined another Masonic order. And I was lucky enough to be able to buy one of the oak and leather couches that they had there. So my husband hates it, and I love it. It's too short for him, but it's a great old couch, and they had 6 of them. I suppose they used them in various things around them. And then George Norris and some of his Beaver City friends, he grew the beard because he wanted to appear older when he was in Beaver City. He thought that would help. These guys went quail hunting one day, and one of his friends, they kind of spread out when they got to this field, and one of his friends mistakenly shot George Norris. And he had 22 shots in his eye and his cheek. And by the time they got to him, he was groping around on the ground for his gun. He was going to end his life. He couldn't possibly, he thought, live in blindness. They got to him, they got him to a doctor, and even by the time the doctor looked at him, he was getting sight back in his eye. But actually, we almost lost George 3 different times. That was one of them. So, and you see in some times in pictures, one eye seems to droop a little bit. And then yesterday I was shown a little article that said that he had eye surgery in 1922, which I did not know. So this was his building that he built in Beaver City. It's called the Norris Block, it says up there. And it cost $20,000, which was quite a bit of money. And his office was to the back on the 2nd floor. And down below were different shops, and it's still standing. I had a man through on a tour one time at the Norris House, and we got down in the basement in the displays, and he said, I used to own that building. And I said, really? And he said, do you want the abstract? And of course, historian always wants the abstract. And I said, sure. So he gave it to us. So we now have the abstract for that building. And he married in Beaver City. He married the daughter of the grist mill or mill owner, and she was Pluma Norris, Pluma Lashley, and they were married in June 1890. And the week before they were expecting their very first baby, they went for a buggy ride. They were going down the valley. There was a farmer's daughter riding toward them on her horse, and they both kind of pulled over to give room. but a gust of wind caught her riding habit and scared George Norris's horse. It was a young filly, and she leaped into the ditch, and the buggy did not overturn, and George was able to drive it out, but it gave, of course, everyone a fright. And when the baby was born dead a week later, the doctor thought that that fright was probably what had happened. So his first little boy that could have carried on the name was gone. But then Pluma had Hazel and Marion before they left Beaver City. When they moved to McCook then, they bought the house in 1899, I'm sorry, in McCook, because it was more centrally located, and he was a district judge at this point, and he had to go to all of these different courts around. So McCook had the trains that served a lot of those, and so they moved to McCook. And when she was in McCook, she had the youngest girl, Gertrude, or DeWitt, as they called her. But she died about 2 days after the baby was born. And so this left George Norris alone with 3 little girls to raise. And this is his sister, Emma, came out and helped, and she was very partial to Gertrude, or DeWitt. And Emma never married all of her life. She was very close to these girls, but she helped take care of them so George could run for Congress. Oh, and I was going to, for some reason it doesn't like my finger. There. This was his congressional portrait for his campaign poster. I think he looks quite sickly. He was quite a handsome man, but this makes him look pathetic. And actually, he was having teeth problems about this time, too. Dr. Green actually came over from Beaver City to help him out with it. And he was in the house one day on his bed, and he could hear the children playing outside, and he sensed a presence in the room, and it was Hazel, his oldest daughter. She was there, and he said, "Hazel, why don't you go out and play with the other kids?" And she said, "No, Papa, I'd rather be in here with you." Well, he had come very close to committing suicide about that time. His mother was called Melancholy, and they had bouts of depression. And Hazel being with him and refusing to go out that day, he got to thinking about what would they do. He was it for them. And he kind of changed at that point, decided to go on, run for Congress. But Hazel was always special to him. I think he felt that she had saved him, and she was kind of his favorite. This was his next wife, Ellie Leonard. And she was a school teacher and a principal about a block away from the Norris house at Westward. And after Pluma died, George got on the school board, the local school board. He'd been involved in that in Beaver City, too. But he and the president of the school board would ride between the different schools on their visitations on their bicycles. And the president made notice one day that he was taking a really nice interest in the teachers, and George smiled and said, "Yeah, especially one teacher," and that was Ellie. But of course back then it wasn't very proper to be dating if you were a school teacher. So when the school session ended that year, Ellie resigned and she went out to San Jose, California, where her parents lived. They raised fruit trees out there. And so when George got away, he went out there in June to San Jose, and they were married in her parents' living room. And then they went straight from San Jose up to Wapaka, Wisconsin for the reunion, of course, and so his friends were the first ones to meet his new wife. But that way, when they came back to McCook, they were an old married couple, and they'd been married for quite a while. So they were married in June of that year, and then she came back and was a lovely wife to his daughters. About 2 years before this picture was taken, Ellie actually had twin boys in Washington, D.C., but they both died before the night was over. and they weren't too sure about Ellie. But she made it, and she was an absolute wonder. I think George called her the angel that flew into our life, and very definitely. I love that picture of them. But the girls were devoted to Ellie too, all of their lives. Ellie died in 1972 in McCook, the mom. And then Hazel, the oldest girl, she died in 1974 in Washington, D.C., and Marion died in 1997 in California, and then the little one died, DeWitt. She died in 1993 in Maryland. So Marion lived the longest, but I love that picture of them. And the three little girls, when they were in Washington, and I can't remember, I read this in an interview with Ellie, but it was always their custom at night. The girls would always get a goodnight kiss from Dad before they went to bed. Well, this particular night, George was in the study, and if the study door was closed, nobody disturbed it. It was up to him to open it, and usually he did, no problem. But he and Ellie and the girls sat on the top step that night, and they waited about as long as Ellie thought they could wait. And so finally she said, "Okay, girls, go ahead." And so they each tiptoed up to the door, and they kissed the doorknob, and they went to bed. They weren't going to miss it. And like I said, Hazel was kind of always his favorite. But this was Hazel's wedding picture. She was married in Washington, D.C. And he always said about Hazel, and she really did look a lot like him, especially when she was little, that he could never deny paternity on that one because she was the spitting image of him, his own self. This was a picture of George in the backyard of the cottage up at Wapaka. And you can tell he was just kind of a different man up there than he was, or that he had to be in McCook, or that he had to be in Washington, D.C. He loved it. He would go up there a lot to just get away from it all. This was an interesting story. This is where we about lost George Norris again. This was a trial that happened in in Stockville, Nebraska. But there was an old man from Kansas who had rental property in Nebraska, James Jansen. And he would walk up from Kansas once a year and walk around to his properties and collect the rent. And he carried everything in a big black satchel. And if that doesn't sound like trouble to me, a guy walking with a satchel full of money. But he was last seen in December of 1897 going north out of Indianola, Nebraska. And this man, Andrew Hawkins, lived by Freedom, Nebraska, which is in Frontier County. So after a couple of months, his son came up looking for him because it wasn't like him not to show up. And so they got to looking around. They figured foul play. They asked Andrew Hawkins, and he swore, no, he was here. He collected the rent. The last I saw him, he was walking up the drive to the main road, and that was the last he saw. But one of the neighbors remembered seeing some activity around an abandoned well. And this was midwinter then. So in the spring, they lowered a young man head first down into this abandoned well. And under 13 feet or 15 feet of manure, they found the remains of James Jansen. So they had an inquest and they had this trial. This was the jury and the bailiff. And Judge Norris found him, or the jury found him guilty. And he had two lawyers, which I find interesting. And they immediately appealed for a new trial. And the sheriff all of a sudden whisked Hawkins out of the room. And Norris denied the appeal for a new trial and sentenced him to life without him being in the room. And as Norris was getting in his buggy, he saw the sheriff with the prisoner shackled to a wagon out there, and he said, "What did you think you were doing, taking the prisoner out of my courtroom?" And the sheriff said, "If I hadn't, you wouldn't be here." He had someone slip him a 45 caliber or 38. I think he had a 38 with 2 bullets in it, And if he was denied a retrial, he was going to shoot Judge Norris and shoot himself. So it was averted once again. I had a little old lady at the Norris house one day. She crossed her arms and she said, yeah, and if he had shot him, I'd probably still be setting out on the farm in the dark. This was the house in McCook when they bought it in 98, 99, yeah. And it was built actually in 1886 by a railroader, Frank Harris. And then they, like I say, moved over to be more centrally located. At that time, it was at 706 Main Street. And while they were in Washington, D.C. for extended periods of time, they rented it out, and it did get run down. And Harry Strunk, the publisher of the McCook Gazette, was referring to it as the eyesore of McCook in the Gazette. So they decided perhaps they should work on it, and so they did. They extensively remodeled it. They incorporated the wraparound porch into the house. They had 4 smaller bedrooms upstairs. They made those into 3 larger bedrooms, and the really unique thing about that is all 3 bedrooms in 1931 in McCook had their own bathroom, which was very unusual. It wasn't fancy, though, at all. It was a very plain house, but had a fireplace, front staircase now. It's still furnished there with the original furnishings. He loved Oriental rugs, so he has some really nice Oriental rugs. His bookcases with all of his books are there, his chairs, pretty much everything is still there. Our office, I'll show you when we get to another picture of the back of the house. That was George in his sunroom. He loved that sunroom if it was off to the south, of course, but he could sit in there and work on his correspondence, but he had a really good view of the park across the street, and he had helped plant and take care of those trees over there. So, and he loved trees, so he really enjoyed the sunroom. There he's listening to the radio and following along on World War II with the maps. This was the picture of the back of the house with a family picnic out there. George has his cigar. He did in the last one too. He usually had a cigar going. The part that sticks out is the staircase. One goes up to the kitchen and the other goes down to the basement. But when Mrs. Norris could no longer get up and down the stairs in the house after George had passed away, they added on a room there and made it a bedroom with an extremely small bathroom, but for her use. And so that now fills in that corner. I did it again. I'm too strong. That's a picture of the Norris house as it is today. They changed, while I was working there, they changed it back to the original colors. It was kind of just a stucco gray color. It was kind of a yellowish. It was funny. Sometimes in the morning it would look yellow, and then in the evening at sundown it would look pink. But it's gray now, and it's going to stay that way. There's a new sculpture out front of George, a very nice bronze sculpture of George sitting on a park bench, and he has the Omaha World Herald, and I think he has the Lincoln paper and the McCook Gazette next to him. Of course, someone, right after they put it up, had to put a bottle of wine and 2 glasses there, so everybody was driving by to see George's edition. There were a lot of honors that came his way. One was there is a stamp on the 100th anniversary of his birth. There were a lot of events then, and those are his 2 daughters, Gertrude and Marion, doing that. There's also a George Norris Day every year. The 5th of January, I think, is still officially George Norris Day. I don't think the teachers celebrate it as much as they used to. And also the unicameral, the chamber where they meet is the George Norris Chamber. And this was George getting the Cardinal Newman Award in 1933 for his distinguished contributions in human welfare in the field of statesmanship for almost half a century. George looks rather mystified. This, I love the picture of his little George Norris Raft, looks like me in this light, christening the SS George W. Norris ship during World War II. And of course, Ellie is there, and Marion, and then Gretchen, and George Norris Rath. George Norris Rath I used to talk to on the telephone. He was a professor, I'm not sure, I think in history. And then Gretchen was a math professor at a college too. So. Nobody has gone into politics though in the family. I was kind of surprised at that. Of course, this is George Norris standing in front of Norris Dam that is right next to Norris, Tennessee. Not many of us have towns named after us. It was a planned community built by the government and model plan city, they called it. And it's near Knoxville too. And again, on the 100th anniversary of his birth, there were a lot of speeches, a lot of programs. That's also McCookite, Frank B. Morrison, who was governor at the time, talking about him. McCook actually has had 3 governors. They had Ralph G. Brooks and Frank Morrison and Ben Nelson. And we've had 2 senators, of course, George Norris and Ben Nelson. And actually, we have another governor. He was governor of Wyoming. I don't know if that counts. So we kind of have 4. And when he came home, of course, trains to McCook run at either 2 a.m. or 4 a.m., depending on which way you go. So there's never a real welcoming committee, but his friend Carl Marsh met him at the train. Ellie's standing behind there, took him up to his house. And he said, I entered the house which I had built and turned on the lights, illuminating those familiar rooms. I was home to spend my remaining days. Carl Marsh was always a good friend of his. And this shows him in his new office down at Carl Marsh's. He had a kind of a routine for the morning when he was home. He did not have a car. He had left it, I think sold it to his brother or son-in-law, John Robertson. And so when he came back, it was downhill down to Marsh's office. So he'd make the toast, Ellie'd make breakfast, George did the toast, and then he would walk down the hill, stop at the post office on the way, get the mail, and go to the Marsh office. And he would, talk to people who'd stop in to see him. He met Jack Dempsey, actually, in this office, and he and Dempsey traded hats, and the hat's still in the Norris house, too. But then he'd always find somebody to give him a ride back up the hill at the end of the night. Because like he said, he wasn't getting any younger. And again, him in the sunroom, he finished dictating his autobiography in this room just 2 weeks before he died. And he did donate the 37 Buick Special with the straight 8 engine. It came back to McCook, and it's now out in the garage. John Robertson wanted it to be there. The family wanted the house to be just as George lived, except for the only real difference besides the room that they added on for Ellie was a 1951 Hot Point unit, which was the refrigerator and the stove, and even the sink was Hot Point. So it has that modern kitchen still. So, but they wanted people to see how he actually lived. And he didn't expect to live that long. What did he say? He said this birthday, and it was his 84th, he was being interviewed, it was his 84th birthday in 1944, July 11th, 44. He said, this birthday only means that it's getting closer to the end. I'm not as strong as I used to be, and I'm very nervous. Like I say, he had bouts with nervousness all through his life, or jitters. He called them jitters, too. However, I still enjoy reading books and talking to people. That's kind of a sad picture. I call it Sad George. And the funeral, he had a cerebral hemorrhage during the night, and Ellie, they slept in separate bedrooms, and Ellie went in to close the window. It was raining, and she went in to close the window and asked him if it was okay or if he wanted it closed, and he didn't answer, and she just figured he was asleep. And then as she was walking out, she thought she heard him say something, but then he didn't say anything, so she went on to bed. And at 7 o'clock, we have a church that chimes every morning for every hour, but it chimed at 7, and she kind of hollered at him when she got up, there's our chimes, let's get up. and didn't have an answer. And she went in, and he was not dead. He lasted about 3 or 4 days, but he was pretty well incoherent. Although when Roosevelt sent him a telegram, Ellie asked if he would squeeze her hand if he heard it, and they read him the telegram from FDR, and she did feel a squeeze, so he did know that. He was buried in McCook at Memorial Park. Thank you. Memorial Park Cemetery. And, oh, one other story about when he died, Governor Morrison's son, Biff, was just a boy, and he was coming home from the movies down the street, and he was walking by just as the mortician was wheeling George Norris out. So he ran, he said, all the rest of the way home to be the first one to tell his dad that the senator had passed away. He was very proud of that. And at the cemetery in the park, or in the cemetery, the REA provides a light, so George's grave is always the one with the flag flying over it, and it's lighted all the time. And this is, I think, my favorite quote about George Norris. If I were a senator and George Norris should be there in the Senate, and I should come in late, not knowing nothing about the issue to be voted on, I should find out how George Norris had voted and vote the same, knowing I had done no disservice to the people. And I think that's quite a compliment. If someone, and that's coming from newsmen, and they're a little jaded, but Charles Ross was the head of the Washington Bureau for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, actually. But like I said, newsmen loved him. And I said I'd say a little bit more about TVA. This was George visiting one of the TVA dams during construction. They got so many things. They got nitrous fertilizer. It ended the erosion that was going on in those 7 southern states. It controlled the river. They could use it for transportation now. Just changed lives. And it disrupted a lot of people, too. Some of the people where the dams were to fill in, of course, had to leave land that had been in their family for generations. So there were some bad feelings, too, but TVA has been good over the years. And George, with John Senning, he was a professor at University of Nebraska, really more his idea on the unicameral, but George wore out one whole car in the Sandhills, he said, campaigning for the unicameral. And George compared it, I like this comparison, to a large bank. He said a large bank needs but one set of board of directors. Why should a state need any more governance than that? And he's true. I mean, he compared the governor to the president of the bank and the board of directors to the legislature. And of course, we, the people, were the customers at the bank. So seems to work for us. And he never passed up a chance to get back on the farm. He loved the farm, but of course REA just changed lives forever on the farm. He was visiting in Custer County one day on a hot, hot summer day, and there was a woman trying to fan and keep the flies off of her baby during his visit. And he thought, it's just a matter of circumstance that this poor woman has to do this while her friend or her relative in town 3 or 4 miles away has electricity, and it's not fair. He knew that his mother, certainly all farm women, had worked far too hard, and the men. I mean, it changed the lives of the men with electricity on the farms too, but he never passed up a chance to hang around. This one I just had to include because of the Wall Street thing. George hated people making money that they didn't really need. Well, not didn't need, but should spread it around a little bit. I had a quote somewhere that, oh yeah, here it was. It was Mr. Astor. He said, what can Mr. Astor do with 80 million that he can't do with 36 million, you know? So, actually, George Norris is very relevant. I think that's the end of my slideshow, so I guess that's the end. Are there any questions? Okay. Thank you. Yes, sir.
George Norris was voted best and most effective U.S. senator of all the senators in the history of the United States. Which group voted him that honor?
There was controversy in that. Did you all hear that question? He said George Norris was voted the most effective and the best senator by a group, and there was politics involved. And I read about that just yesterday, and I can't tell you which group it was, but then he was not included. It was my understanding, because of politics. He got the most votes.
What group? Don't know.
I don't know at the moment. I saw it yesterday, but if you call me, I can tell you.
Historians, maybe.
Well, you know, there were several groups and several votes, and maybe that's why the confusion. But I know he was voted the top vote getter on one of senators, and in the end was not included at all in the group. So I think there might have been several lists. Yep. Any other questions? Yes.
The pictures of a young George Norris
Yes.
and a young Bob Carey, there's
Yeah.
a resemblance there. Were those two families related?
No. She asked if Bob Carey and George Norris were related. And no, not that I know of, but there is a little resemblance. And I think Carey was a real Norris fan, too. I think George was a little heavier. Well, I think Carey, maybe when he was younger, had a little fatter face. So holler if you have questions, because I can't see anything. Well, if there aren't any questions, I just want to thank you for taking time and learning a little bit more about the man and just not all the things that he did, maybe. So thank you.